All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and I've been going over the PowerPoint presentations for Terry Felke-Morris's Web Development and Design with HTML5 8th edition. I'm up to Chapter 11 of 14, and in here, as it says, we're going to talk HTML audio and video. Let me just preface this by telling you that one of the reasons that HTML5 even came to be is the fact that there has never been a lot of agreement over how to do audio and video. There are a lot of formats that a lot of different companies use. Some are proprietary, some are not. All right, for years everyone used Flash for anything that you did that involved animation. And years ago, Apple basically came out and said they weren't going to be supporting Flash anymore. All right. So to try to bring some standardization to this, that's what one of the things that HTML5 is attempting to do. The problem is it hasn't happened yet. It's a slowly evolving process. So we've got about 10 or so objectives in here. Describe the purpose of plugins, helper applications, media containers, and codecs. Describe types of multimedia files used on the web. Configure hyperlinks for multimedia files. Configure audio and video on a web page. Describe features of Flash, JavaScript, Java applets, Ajax, and jQuery. Configure a Flash animation on a web page. Configure a Java applet on a web page. And then the last three are going to come back, and they're not so much concerned with just audio video, but you'll notice they're more back to the HTML, CSS. All right, so create an interactive image gallery with CSS, and there's other ways it can be done also. Talk about the CSS3 transform and transition properties. And finally, describe the purpose of such HTML5 features as geolocation, web storage, offline web location, or offline web applications, and canvas. All right, so here's a couple definitions. A helper application, a program that can be designed to handle a particular file type, like a WAV file or an MPG file, to allow the user to view or otherwise utilize that special file. It runs in a separate window from the browser. For instance, what I'm doing right now, when I save these, when I save the presentation that I'm working on, it gets saved as, I believe it's a .camrec for Camtasia recording file. All right. And when I'm done, I go and produce it, and it becomes, I have to create a project file first, and then I produce it, and it becomes an MP4 file. If I double click that MP4 file, it brings up the presentation that I've done. Okay. A plugin is a newer and more common method than the helper app. It runs right in the browser, so you can integrate stuff directly into the web page. Containers contain the media and the metadata. Metadata is data about data. A codec is an algorithm used to compress media. Again, HTML5 audio and video native to the browser. Browsers do not all support the same codecs. If you want more, you can go out to the URL that you see right here. So here's some commonly used plugins. Adobe Flash, Adobe Reader, Windows Media Player, and Apple QuickTime. Sometimes if you've got an audio or a video file and you double click it, it'll bring it up. And it'll typically bring it up in the default app. So I'm working in Windows. Typically when I bring up an audio file, it brings it up in Media Player. I've also got a Mac or an Apple machine, and if I double click a file there, it typically brings it up in Apple QuickTime. Here are some common audio file types. I'm not going to go through any of these. I will mention that, to my knowledge, the ones you're going to see probably the most often, at least the ones that I deal with, are .wav files and .mp3 files. You'll notice if you look, there's a .ogg there, ogg vorbis files. The key thing there, as it says, is those are open source. And there are many people pushing to make that the standard, although it's not right now, to my knowledge. Common video file types. Again, the ones that I deal with most often, .mp4. You'll also notice that there was OGG for Og Vorbis. There's also OGV for Og Theora, another open source. Copyright issues. Only publish web pages, images, and other media that you have personally created or that you have obtained the rights or license to use. Now, I'm not sure how it works at Rankin Technical College. I know at the school I used to work at, when you started to talk about things like intellectual property, if I created something and put it out on my YouTube channel, for example, it then became the joint property of both me and the educational institution for which I put it out there for. Now, when I left there, the school that I used to be at, I left all my stuff out there. I've got about 1,200 videos that some people, to my knowledge, still use. They're becoming antiquated as the longer that I'm gone from there. Now, here at Rankin, I've probably got close to 500 videos out there, and I plan on doing the same thing. All right? If you are ever going to want to use a video clip or something from somebody else, ask for written permission. Don't just grab it and put it on your website. All work, notice, including web pages, are automatically copyrighted, even if you don't put a copyright symbol on there. The fair use clause, we'll talk about that in class. Creative Commons is pretty neat, and I think it's creativecommons.org. All right, they've got a bunch of rules out there that you can use for copyright. So, how do you do this stuff? Well, let's look at an example right here. Now, I'm going to just show you how this works, okay? I'm going to grab this, but I'm not going to use their MP3 file. I'm going to give you a little glimpse, so to speak, into my world. All right, so this won't say this. I'm going to change it in just a minute. We're going to say Jeff Scott video presentation. And we'll just say here, Jeff Scott video. All right, now this, I don't know where that's from, but that's something from the authors. So what I'm going to show you here is I've got a folder out on my desktop that's called Camrex, and I'm just going to grab one of these. In fact, I'll grab one for a different, here's some database stuff that I did. So I'm giving you right now the path to that, and oh, it's not a Camrec file, I guess. It's a TREC file. That's how they get saved. So I'm going to put that out there, save this, and run it. So you'll notice Jeff Scott video. I click it, and what happens? It says your file cannot be found. Well, that isn't good. Try this. Copy this. Just going to throw it onto my desktop for now. Remove it. Hopefully I'll remember to remove it later. There it is. And if it still doesn't work, I don't want to waste your time, but what I'm trying to show you here is literally what's supposed to be how, oh, it's still not finding it. All right. Here's a free MP3 files for downloading. I'm going out to the freesite.com. Free kid songs.
you smile upside down? I don't know.
Copy the video URL. Let's see if that works. What were they called? The Love Clowns? And there it is. That's how easy that was. All right. Sorry if you've got an aversion to clowns. You know, some people do. But what I was attempting to show you is something like this. What the author shows you on here is she's got links to her podcasts. Okay? All right. Remember that you might have people who are interested in your work. If it's audio work, but they might be deaf. If it's video work, but they might be blind. So you should always provide captions for video, transcripts for audio, in some kind of a text format. All right, you probably have seen that where you provide closed captioning, for example. All right, Adobe Flash, a popular multimedia application. You get what are called SWF files. Back in the day when I started doing this, and probably a good 15 or more years ago when I started taping things, I was creating SWF files. Now, with HTML5, notice what you can do in here. You can embed Flash presentations right into the web page. All right, so you can have SWF files that come up. You can create your own audio and your own video. Now, here's an audio control, and you'll notice in here you've got controls equal controls, and I believe that's what gives you this. And there's more things that you can put in here also. Notice we've got two different sources in here, and actually, yeah, two of them here, which might sound confusing. We've got both an MP3 format and an OGG format. And you put them both in there because ideally, if your system doesn't support MP3, it supports OGG, which again, remember, was free. And if it doesn't support OGG, it supports MP3 or whatever. Not only can you set up audio files, you can set up video files. And again, you see there's multiple formats. The width and height, okay, that we see right here are the size that you want this to come on the screen. And if you do play this one, this is her dog, and it barks. I remember watching it once before. All right, so let's jump back into the world of CSS. And notice they're starting to talk about drop-down menus and using CSS for drop-down menus. That's an example right here. All right, here's the nav bar, and when you peruse your way over, for example, cuisine, if you put your mouse over that, you get the drop-down menus of breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So it says you can configure the nav container with position relative. Do a submenu. You'll have an unordered list within an unordered list. You typically will configure the submenu to not display, especially if it's several layers deep. And you configure the submenu with absolute positioning, so it goes where you think it would go. All right, some things you can do with CSS. The transform property. Notice here they've done a little bit of rotate. Why do you do that? Typically for effect. Do you have to do that? Never. Transition. Maybe you've seen this where you've got things that fade in or fade out over time. All right, a real popular one for this today is you go out to a website, and on the bottom of the website or on the side of the website, depending on the site, but let's say on the bottom, you've got icons for Facebook and for Twitter and for LinkedIn. And you take your mouse and you put your mouse over one of the particular icons that I just mentioned. And you get reverse video for the one that's highlighted. And it might come, boom, it might come in like that, or it might fade to reverse video, fade in and fade out. That's typically done using a CSS transition property. You can create your own image gallery using CSS. There are other ways of doing this. I'm not going to say the ways are better or the ways are worse. All right. You can create image galleries using JavaScript. You can create image galleries using jQuery, which is a JavaScript library. The advantages of using especially something like a jQuery image gallery library or plugin are typically you don't have to write a lot of the code. All right, it will be written for you, and you just have to know how to call it and set it up. Whereas when you do it in CSS, there's probably going to be a lot more work that at least at the beginning that you have to do. So the idea is you click on any of these thumbnails and the bigger picture shows over here. A lot of different ways that you can set up galleries. All right, let's talk about a couple programming languages. The fourth course that students take during their tenure at Rankin Technical College is AWD, I believe it's 1112. And it's Beginning Java Programming / Android Programming. It's not the real title, but it's the one I'll use. Java is a programming language. It is a totally object-oriented programming language. All right, meaning that it uses classes and it uses methods and it uses attributes, etc. Java was originally developed by a company called Sun Microsystems. Years ago, it was sold to Oracle, which is a relational database management system company. Java is not the same as JavaScript. It says there it's much more powerful and flexible than JavaScript. Well, it's got a different raison d'etre. In other words, it's got a different reason for being. You can use Java to either develop standalone applications or to create applets, which are invoked by web pages. What's an applet? It's a Java program that runs inside of a browser. Okay? Most programming languages that are both interpreted and compiled, they get interpreted first and then they get compiled. Java's backwards. It gets compiled first into a .class file and then it gets interpreted. And that all happens with a special piece of software that's called the JVM, or the Java Virtual Machine. I'm not going to go into it in any more detail or any more depth or breadth of coverage than that right now. Now, adding an Java applet to the page, they're making this look a lot harder than it is because you don't have to put all this stuff in there. If you put all this in, you'd get Chapter 11, Java applet example, and if you click right there, it would run whatever code was behind the applet. Okay? JavaScript, whereas Java is a full-fledged object-oriented programming language, JavaScript is an object-based language. What's the difference between object-oriented and object-based? When a language is object-oriented, like Java, that means that you have to use classes and object-oriented principles whenever you code. You don't have any choice. When a programming language like JavaScript is object-based, that means that you have the ability to use object-oriented programming capabilities, but you don't have to. It's also a client-side scripting language, which means that it's actually more than that. All right? That's still known as a client-side scripting language, but you can write JavaScript that runs on the server as well. It's probably a good 20 to 30 years old. And JavaScript is interesting for a lot of reasons. Yeah, it's not Java. But one of the most interesting reasons that JavaScript is interesting, one of the most different reasons, for lack of better words, is the fact that unlike HTML and CSS, which are pretty much under the control of the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, JavaScript is under the major control of what's called the ECMA, which is the European Computer Manufacturers Association. JavaScript allows you to manipulate objects associated with a web page document, the window, the document, and different things that are on there. Different things that you can do with JavaScript. The second half of this class, we go through JavaScript. So we'll look at this. But one of the biggest things you do with JavaScript is what's shown right here. It allows you to manipulate the DOM, or the document object model. You can look at that right there, but the bottom line is this. One of the reasons that every single thing on a web page that you give an ID to, we've already looked at IDs, so you know what those are. But one of the major things about JavaScript is anything that you give an ID to, you can manipulate programmatically using JavaScript. And the way that's done is basically done through what's called the DOM. So we will talk about that in the class also. It's a fairly complex topic. Ajax. Ajax is interesting. It's been around for, probably again somewhere around 15 or more years. Maybe closer to 20, I don't know. It originally stood for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. Today, Ajax, it doesn't use XML as much as it did. Rather than using XML, a lot of the work done with Ajax uses a product called JSON, which stands for JavaScript Object Notation. All right? And it's considered a little easier to work with by and large than XML is. Again, I'm just introducing this to you. jQuery. jQuery is a JavaScript library. All right. They talk here about an API. An API is an application program interface. I'm not going to read that to you. I look at an API as kind of being a contract. And if you think about it, if you go to work for a company and you sign a contract, you're agreeing to do a certain type of work and you're going to be compensated for it. So it's an agreement between you and the company that says you will do this and the company will provide that. Well, with an API for programming, what that says is somebody has written some software that you can use. And you agree in this contract that you're going to use it in the way that it was intended to be used. Now, jQuery is an example of an API that you can configure to do a lot of things. It works very much with CSS, so we'll talk about that more later on in the JavaScript portion of the class. As far as some HTML5 APIs, again, remember a protocol that allows software components to communicate, interact, and share data. That's an API. Some of the new ones for HTML5 include geolocation, web storage, offline web apps, and Canvas. Well, I think they're going to talk about each one. Geolocation, maybe you've done this where you've gone out to a site. For instance, if I want to see what movie is playing in, let's say, Wentzville, Missouri, I can go and type right into Google, movies playing currently in Wentzville, Missouri. Sometimes for certain sites, if I go into them, it'll come back out and it'll say that this site wants to know your current location. And I can either agree to provide it or I can decline to provide it. That's using geolocation. As it says, it allows your web page visitors to share their geographic location. If many people use their phones for this. Okay, so for instance, my daughter uses Waze, and I think it's W-A-Z-E, but I'm not sure, even while she's driving, which isn't a good thing. But if she does a lot of driving on her job, and if there's an accident ahead, she might be told that, so it might try to route her in a different way or whatever. Web storage, kind of neat, because what web storage is it allows you to do the equivalent of some database type of storage without having to use an actual database. Rather, you save stuff, if you want to, you save it right on your own machine. I'm making it much simpler than it actually is. Now there's two basic kinds. There's local storage, which will store it forever, and there's session storage, which only stores it as long as the current session that you're working on, so as long as your browser's open, for lack of better words. Offline applications, it's fairly new, it's kind of neat. What it says is, even if you're not connected to the internet, you might be able to get to at least the main page, the home page of a website. Canvas allows you to do a lot more drawing than you used to be able to do, and the author does not do a good job here of explaining, because all she has is a box, and the box has got some text in it, but you can do a lot of actual drawing with this. Remember that when you're referring to this stuff and you're working with multimedia, that accessibility is an important thing to think about. Provide links to plugins so if people don't have them, they can download them. A lot of times today you don't even need to download them, you just will bring them in temporarily. Always provide text descriptions and captions for people who are, have any kind of an impairment. Verify keyboard access. Check for screen flickering. Might not sound like a big thing, but especially people who are prone to, I've heard as an example, people, and maybe I'm wrong here, but I don't think I am, people who are schizophrenic. If you've got a lot of flickering, it can actually put them into episodes, so you want to make sure that doesn't happen. Verify that if somebody turns off JavaScript, they can still do things with your site. Maybe not everything you want them to do, but some things. If media is used for the main navigation, also provide text links. So, we've come to the end of another chapter. We talked a little bit of audio and video. I didn't show you too much, but we talked about plugins versus helper apps versus media containers versus codecs. We looked at multimedia files, including simply making a simple hyperlink to a file. We talked about audio and video, didn't see much about it. We compared and contrasted Flash with JavaScript, Java, Java applets, Ajax, and jQuery. We went back and talked a little bit about CSS, talked about how you can create an interactive image gallery with CSS, how to use the CSS transform and transition properties. And finally, we ended the chapter by talking about some of the newer built-in HTML5 APIs, such as geolocation, web storage, and offline applications, and Canvas. So that's it for this chapter. When I return in a couple minutes, I will be going over the next chapter. And the next chapter will be chapter... Is it 11? No, that's what we just did. So I'll be going over chapter 12. And chapter 12 is on e-commerce. Again, in this chapter, we're not going to go over anything new as far as HTML, CSS, or JavaScript terminology. This is more theoretical in nature. So I'll be back with that lecture very shortly.